I think one of the things that we've noticed during the current crisis, and we keep telling our members we're trying very hard not to make a drama out of a crisis, so we're trying to keep the water as smooth as we can, is that one of the big sectors where people are coming a bit unstuck is those limited companies where directors have been taking the minimum wage.
Yes.
And paying themselves quite a lot in dividends. Now, that appears to have caught a lot out. And our members, the general rule for our members is that you should advise your clients to take a reasonable salary and have a good guess about how the year is going to go. Some other organisations may have slightly different views on that, but people are getting caught out. Now, I know this has been a bugbear for a long time, so now that we've got this crisis swirling round, does this give an organisation like yours the chance to say, well, look, we're almost down to ground zero here, let's really do something radical and change it?
It does, if that's where the Chancellor would like to go. We have done some work in this area in the past, and we'd be very happy to pull that forward and turn it into, a whole series of sort of understanding of the issues so that the Chancellor going forward can make some different decisions. I think there's been quite a lot of people have said that it's unrealistic for the tax burden, and by tax I mean national insurance and income tax together. It's unrealistic for the burden borne by a self-employed person to be higher than it is if that person incorporates a company, provides their services through the company, and then receives some form of income through that company generally. So clearly the country would potentially need to look at all of that. And there's a difference between a labour-only business, if you like, where compared to somebody who sets up a company to employ a lot of people, to grow a business, all that sort of thing. And so it's important that you don't put tax in the way of investing in growing a business. But on the other hand, you do end up with a rather more similar result where you're dealing with primarily freelancers and labour or primarily labour-based businesses. So I do think it's something that we could easily do a position paper on that. It's highlighting the choices and the potential changes there. But everybody should realise that one of the goals through all of this is to end up with something where there isn't a massive tax and national insurance incentive to go down one route versus another route, and that people end up making those choices for business reasons rather than for anything else.
Yeah, I see. Now, the changes to IR35 were held back because of the current problems. Most of our businesses, our members in practice, are themselves either self-employed or small limited companies, micros, and they tend to deal with clients who are micro or small businesses in the main.
Yes.
Some stray into larger firms, but it's not the normal route for a bookkeeper. And we were all getting a little bit concerned that our small self-employed practitioner who looks after, on average, between 20 and 25 clients was suddenly going to have 25 employers. Now, there must be a better way of doing that as far as we're concerned. I don't know if the IR35 element comes into what you're doing.
It has done. I actually gave evidence to the House of Lords Finance Bill Subcommittee on that. I think the first point that we at the OTS wanted to make is the question of status. Knowing whether or not somebody should be treated as employed or not is the key here. And as anyone who's worked in this area knows, it's really complicated because we've had lots of different cases, tax cases, and indeed employment law cases go through over the years. And for us, we should have a statutory test of employment. One, it could be relatively complicated with factors, a points count, that sort of thing. But we need some form of a better agreement on what is an employed person, and therefore, by abstraction, what isn't an employed person, so that we actually know what we're dealing with and we can charge tax and national insurance appropriately. That's what's missing in all of this. It's all very well talking about, the check employee status tool from HMRC, which has got massively better. But still,
Yeah, it's still a little vague, isn't it?
issues.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. And some of the sort of criteria in there, you're sort of thinking, well, I know that's how life started off 30, 40, 50 years ago, but is that relevant today? Not necessarily. And for us, it would be better to go forward with a statutory test. I think it would take a couple of years to do,
Yes.
make sure that all the issues had actually been taken into account. But overall, I think you'd end up with a better position if you did have that.
Yes, I think most of our members are very well. They move around a lot. You know, they are
Sure.
they have a laptop nowadays. Normally, they have several licenses, one for each of their clients, and they will go to see their client far more often than, say, the accountant would, who's dealing just the year-end accounts.
Yeah.
So they may be visiting on a weekly or a monthly basis, but it's very much more flexible than it used to be when you actually went to 10 different offices and had 10 different computers in the corner of the room somewhere that you logged on to and you did everything. And therefore, they are, I think, proving themselves to be actually more independent. But I think sometimes that it appears that government, quite rightly, is trying to catch people who are using the system. So those people that, you know, leave a company as their chairman and suddenly becomes a self-employed person on a huge salary or something, or, you know, that sort of thing. But at our end, I always feel that if we're not careful, we're going to get snowballed into something which might not be acceptable. So we need to obviously lobby you and government to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Well, but at the bottom of it, you need clarity. So people need to know, how am I realistically being treated? What are my tax obligations? What do I need to take into account when I'm pricing my service, for example? Yes. I mean, I would start off by saying anybody who's got 25 clients is unlikely to be in the sort of IR35 stuff. It sounds like a self-employed business to me.
Well, it would. The problem, I think, the only time it's ever been challenged is when somebody gets their first client.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
If your first client is your former employer, then you will find it difficult. We know that. But if you get your first client and then your second and your third and your fourth, at what point do you become safe, as it were, from being caught? So that's always a question that they have, and I think some people worry about it. Where do you think that the current situation or any other government direction is likely to try and get more people to stop being self-employed? Because when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, there was an incentive offered, and I think a lot of people suddenly became very small limited companies. I mean, is there any sense in doing that again, or actually are self-employed people okay in government books?
Oh, and I think self-employed people are a fundamental, important part of the British economy. We've seen the numbers grow, so there's now about 15% of the workforce is self-employed.
Yeah.
There are at least 500,000 people who are both self-employed and employed, which is sort of more interesting generally. But no, I think government should be keen to support the self-employed market, thanks to the labour market flexibility that truly offers people. We are a service economy primarily, and part of the self-employed provision of services comes from being self-employed more generally. I think it's fair to say. But whether it.
Yeah. Sorry. I've lost you there somewhere.
Sorry, if my sound gone a bit awry. I was just saying, the form you adopt, whether it's, a sole trader, a partner in a limited liability partnership, or through a company, you ought to end up with a similar tax and national insurance burden through all of that, so that you make the choices for what works for you, rather than based primarily on paying less tax or national insurance. I think that ought to be a better rule.
Yes. Excuse me, quite a lot of our members begin their term as a practicing bookkeeper whilst doing another job. So they will be bookkeepers somewhere, or accountants or assistants or whatever, or sometimes something completely different. They don't quite have the nerve to jump straight out into the fire, as it were. So they will do a certain amount of part-time freelance work and then build it up over time. So I can see that happens a lot. And of course, a lot of people, I think, have I think they sometimes quite rudely call them lifestyle businesses, where somebody is doing a full-time job, and then it's at one end is, I don't know, designing jewelry or selling ties or whatever it might be as a side income, as it were.
Mm.
I mean,
I suspect there are few of those lifestyle businesses that I think they make a good headline, but I think there's actually a lot of people who need some money. And that's why they do it. And they usually pick something that they know about and they like, because they've got a better chance of being successful in that area.
yeah, absolutely. What I think the main thing that we find from our members with their new clients is that most people know absolutely what they're making or what services that they're offering, but they never went into this to become financial experts, and therefore, the VAT return is like giving them something with foreign language all over it. So thankfully there is business there for that. I think there's something still in the region of about 3 million people who do it themselves.
Yes.
And they are in many ways being aided and assisted by software. The main software companies have all got a do-it-yourself at-home package, if you like.
Sure.
But we are finding that rather than that cutting back on the work that's for a bookkeeper, a lot of those people who had a bit of fun and experimented realize after a while that actually they can earn more doing whatever it is they're really doing and handing it over to a bookkeeper or an accountant or a tax advisor, whoever. So the people who had the great doom and gloom that we're all dead, the bookkeepers are gone, they're all going to disappear, it's not happening. And in fact, last year our members put on an extra, I forgot the exact figure, but it's just over 10,500 new clients in 1 year. I mean, that is quite phenomenal. I think it's the biggest growth we've ever seen.
And that's great, but it also bears out the point you're making that if you say, business is quite complicated, and most people who set out in business don't know enough about accounting, and so having a qualified bookkeeper to, frankly tell them how much money they're making or not making every month is really, really important. So I'm not surprised to find that there's a demand and a growth in demand for services.
I often say the only people who ever set out in business to do the bookkeeping are bookkeepers. everybody else did something else,
That's certainly true of all the self-employed people I personally know. They all want someone else to do it, and they're happy to pay them for it because it's not what they're best at doing.
Do you have any sort of divine answer for how we continue to drive down the grey economy? Because the cashless society is presumably helping a lot, but one of the things that our members have to do is be very, very careful, particularly as they are regulated now under money laundering regulations and fraud regulations. They have to be careful that nobody tries to put the odd spare car through or holidays or whatever. But do you think we're getting better as a country?
That's a very tricky question. I think we have the opportunity to get better. I do think that moving more of us onto using software to maintain our accounting records is a big driver of that, along with the fact that the cash economy is getting smaller. It's still huge, but there's no reason why you should pay your cleaner who comes in once a morning, does one morning a week or something like that. There's no reason why you shouldn't pay that person cash. But overall, the cash economy has got miles smaller. There are lots of small businesses you see today where you go in, I'll order a cup of coffee, and you can't pay other than by card. No. So big changes there, yes. And I think that is the biggest sort of area where you're likely to see the grey economy reduced from all of that.
Right.
And there's also a question, I think, of what is the social acceptability of everything? That is a really sort of, quite a sort of difficult question to approach. But if you've got the vast majority of people paying tax in full on their income, there'll be less support for those who appear to be paying less tax on their income generally.
Yes.
And the final point is that, for some of us, it's a question of, do we look for cutting our cost of buying a service by offering cash, and perhaps putting the recipient under pressure in that sort of way, or do we accept that actually that's not the right way forward, and we should be looking to make sure that everyone's in the tent rather than a few people outside it?
Yes, there's always this sort of question, I think, that does the government have an idea in its mind of saying, well, look, we're never going to get tax from everybody, but let's concentrate on getting tax from as many as possible and concentrate on what the marketing people call the low-hanging fruit, basically, rather than make life difficult. But that doesn't pander to fairness, really.
Yes, yes.
It is unfair to see people getting away with it. And many years ago,
I think if you look and see what one or two other countries have done, so Spain and Brazil and Russia now require that a business submits details of its transactions every day to the tax authority. In Brazil, you can't get a tax deduction for something you've spent unless the person that you bought it from has reported it. Now, that is a massive, massive cost on the economy, but those countries felt it was essential because of the very high level of evasion.
yes.
I think that's much less likely in this country, where I think, yes, of course we have evasion, but it's, I think, at a much lower level. I'm not sure it would justify that level of investment and intrusiveness and that sort of thing. But that is a possible option if it's still felt to be out of control.
Yes, I think Russia tended to be very large state-run businesses, so it wasn't quite as difficult as now it is for them, where they have lots of smaller businesses coming up. And I know when we were registering students there, probably 10 years ago now, they had to send us an invoice, which we signed to say was okay. They then took it back. Then they got somebody over there to sign to say that they could send us that money. Then we had to sign to say we were about to receive it and confirm when we'd received it. So I think it was 7 transactions for most payments, which slows everything down.
Yes.
But I presume somebody at the other end knew exactly where all the money was going, which was something. Which is strange that they're always known as a country that is so corrupt. But anyway.
Well, I'm told it is possible to go to the central VAT center in Russia, and you can see millions and millions of transactions flow across the wires in real time, which must be quite incredible.
Yeah, I mean, we had a discussion some time ago with, I forget which particular department of government it was, but they were talking about issuing licenses to every trade and profession, so that everybody, a bit like if you go to America and you get in a taxi, there's a license number there and it tells you how long it is, where it runs out, etc. So you'd have a plumber that would come to your door, and around his neck he'd have an identity card with a zip code, and you'd zap him with your phone, and up on the phone would come a picture of the person. If the two didn't match, you didn't let them through the door. It's a bit of a long-winded system, but actually I think it would work wonderfully well.
Yes, and we've started that in the UK with minicab drivers. You can only get a minicab or taxi license if the local authority has established that you are known to HMRC and are, you register with HMRC generally. We've just started that system, and I could easily see that being broadened to other areas too.
Yeah, I mean, we have something similar because of the money laundering regulations for bookkeepers, accountants, and lawyers. Indeed, everybody has to be licensed now. Now, that's not to say that the public realizes this, so would therefore necessarily turn somebody away at their door or ask for a license. But I think that's something that we as a profession have to do. But I think we're moving that way. But on the side of taxation, many years ago, I was invited across as a guest of the Uzbekistan government because they had decided that, obviously, to separate themselves more and more from Russia. So Russia had taken home all its toys, including every bit of legislation, every bit of financial regulation, the lot. So the man that was hosting me was the Minister of Finance, and he had personally, or with his team, completely rewritten the system of taxation and everything else. And he was saying that on corporation tax, when corporation tax was 60%, everybody sided with the businessman. And it was one of those things that Jack Nolan was a businessman, he was doing, it didn't matter that he was cheating the government. But when they got it down, I think when I was there, it was down to about 12%. everybody said, well, look, you should pay your tax because that's our money if you don't pay it. So
Yes.
everybody turned on the business to the stage where the business is then, oh, right, okay, yeah. And it became far more above board. So like you say, it's probably like smoking, like wearing seatbelts and everything else. Before you legislate, you can actually make it not publicly acceptable to do these things. So hopefully that works.
And you also have the opportunity of introducing a simpler system and potentially more, electronic filing from the very start. Estonia is a very good example, again, of somewhere with a relatively flat tax, very few allowances, that sort of thing, very high level of electronic online compliance. But it is so much easier when you didn't have a tax system because you were part of the Soviet Union. But now you're out in your own and you've got to raise some money and away you go.
So by the end of COVID, you're not going to turn around and come up with this marvelous flat tax system for everybody in the country. Then that's not going to be there.
I very much doubt it.
Okay.
I think going from where we are to a flat tax would be, too big a change to be realistic. Even if you think that some of the tax reliefs aren't necessarily needed or aren't worth the money, the vast bulk of them are worth the money overall. And I can't imagine that we'd want to propose a sort of flat tax in that system. Doesn't sound very fair.
No. But do you think that there are going to be some major changes that you're going to be able or asked to bring out because of the fact that we're all using government money at the moment?
Well, the Chancellor made it clear that when he introduced the self-employed system, he was going to be coming back for some more tax from self-employed people. And, whether that's through increased national insurance or something else, we're just going to have to wait and see. And that probably will have a sort of knock-on effect of the taxation of companies and owner managers and that sort of thing. I see from one of our questions, somebody said, hasn't the gap between people who pay themselves a low wage and take dividends narrowed following the taxation of dividends and the £2,000 dividend allowance? And I think that's right. It has narrowed. But equally, there's some evidence to show that if you have a company, some people split the income between multiple members of the family. Some people have the opportunity to leave some money in the company so that they don't pay tax at a higher rate, sort of smooth their own earnings over a number of years. And these are opportunities not available to the directly self-employed person or to the employee. So I think there still are some planning opportunities or other things that people do where overall companies end up paying a little less tax than a self-employed person, and both end up paying massively less tax than an employee, primarily due to employers' national insurance. One of the options that other countries have looked at is introducing some form of contractor levy or something like that. A levy paid by the engager of a freelancer, for example. And Australia has that type of system.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not saying it's popular, but it's clear we will need to raise some money because the country is investing huge amount in supporting people through this terrible virus.
The only problem is, though, if you're going to levy the user of a freelance service, isn't that going to stop freelancers providing that service? Why would you therefore not go to a small limited company that's offering the same service, but you just pay them their bill?
Well, you'd end up having to equalize to make sure that there wasn't an advantage for one group of people versus another. You don't want to push people into adopting a form of doing business just by the tax rate. You want them to adopt their form of business to what suits the business commercially, and tax and national insurance together should be broadly similar, however you go around it.
Could the VAT system to be used to try and level that out by reducing the 85,000 and bringing it down, or even taking it away?
That's really a pretty blunt instrument. The Office of Tax Simplification did look at that. We produced a report in November 2017 that said, the VAT threshold is higher in the UK than anywhere else almost, and that has the advantage that it takes millions of businesses out of having to do VAT to compliance. It also gives those businesses, if they're providing services to consumers, an advantage because they're not bearing VAT in the system generally. And if you reduce that threshold, you do make life hard for those consumer-facing businesses generally. And nobody's come forward with a brilliant idea for how you might sort of spread the effect, if you like, as you go through that. You might offer, if you reduce the threshold from say 85 down to 60, and that's just to suppose. I've got no reason to think.
No, it's all right. It's okay.
You can say, well, we'll give you half the extra VAT back if you like, for 2 years or something like that to spread it in. But ultimately, it's quite a big sort of transition for those businesses to get through.
Yeah, I see that. Amy, are you there? How are we doing on questions? Have you got any questions for Bill?
Yes, there's been quite a lot of talk of risk and people saying, Lee, and one of our anonymous members has said, obviously the self-employed do take on quite a lot of risk, and then they don't get statutory sick pay, and they don't, they're not sort of automatically opted into their pension scheme. And even if, they would perhaps, welcome parity with their employed equivalents and the rest of the employed population. But, what could there be that could help them with things like that?
Well, firstly, I obviously agree that there is a certain element of uncertainty. Will the customer come in the door if you're a self-employed person running a business? Now, if you're an employee on a fixed-term contract or on some versions of 0 hours contracts, you also have that level of uncertainty, and that isn't they don't get a benefit through the system because of their particular uncertainty. Whereas the self-employed person does in the form of a 3% lower national insurance rate, and the fact that, of course, employers' national insurance isn't charged at all. And I know some people say, well, that's not paid by the individual, it's paid by the engaging business. But I think businesses, when you're thinking about, can I take on an employee, you're really adding up the total cost of employment, not just the salary. You're also thinking about the auto-enrollment pension contributions. You're also thinking about the employer's national insurance. And if you're a big business, then you're thinking clearly about the apprenticeship levy generally. So I do think you've got to look at all of that together. I personally still believe that there should be an allowance for risk in the system. I completely accept that as a fair point. But I suspect that the gap is too big at this stage.
Paula VC Smith actually has asked about the risk that the employer of a small limited company takes on when employing staff, and she's wondering about what do you think is going to be the significance of this whole COVID process on the future of tax, and if the tax regime changes, will there still be an incentive for individuals to set up a business and then take on that risk, employ their staff, look after them?
Well, overall, I think people set up their own business often because that's what they actually want to do. And for many people, they make more money out of running their business in that sort of manner than they might do as an employee of perhaps a much larger corporation more generally. Some of us are better cut out to be self-employed, leading a business than others, and it's a choice that you should end up making. And I agree that, as I say, that there should be some support for that element of uncertainty and risk. There should be some acknowledgement that the flexibility that self-employed people offer to the economy at large is something that it's worth overall recognizing through all of that. But nonetheless, I still think you can't have a gap that is quite as large as it is. And you don't want something that encourages people to make, frankly, the wrong choice, driven more by tax and national insurance costs rather than the realities of the situation. What you don't particularly want, let's just say, is a large company deciding one day, well, we're not going to have any employees do this particular service. Instead, everyone's going to do it self-employed. And that's going to save all of us some money. primarily through tax and national insurance. And that isn't necessarily the best answer for the system at large. And it's not necessarily the best answer for some of the people who find themselves providing that service in that sort of system. They're not necessarily geared up to carrying the risk and uncertainty that perhaps somebody who'd made a choice about running their own business has a better chance of understanding and approaching more generally.
Yeah, I think some of the larger businesses that I've had experience of over the last however many years, when they've tried to put people onto self-employment, it's actually so that the shareholders see the salary bill going down. They're hidden then as some different cost. But also, if we end up with something like COVID, they are disposable. They can be moved out far quicker than an employed person, obviously. So, I think there are a lot of reasons for it. But I do take your point that if you've been building up to becoming self-employed for many years, you are in a better position. I first became self-employed because of a redundancy. So I had about 24 hours to work that one out, and I hadn't got another alternative. But anyway,
and sadly, that's how some people do set off. But some people through that process really discover their vocation. Actually, they're great at running their business.
Great.
You would have
Amy,
done.
how are you doing? Any more? Amy?
Hello. Yes. I suppose there's quite a few questions around this, the support measures that have been announced recently for the COVID-19 period, and just this sense really that there hasn't been enough announced for sole directors of small limited companies, and that ultimately if they, it's difficult for them to furlough themselves because actually they want to keep working a little bit, but their income has been drastically reduced. So like a self-employed person can keep working, but get a grant to cover the loss. A sole director doesn't have that benefit. Do you think that might change?
Well, I can't guess whether that's going to change or not. I do think, though, that it would be very hard for HMRC to operate a system for the owner, manager, directors of small companies. It's easier for them to do it for the self-employed people because they have straightforward records. People have done their self-assessment income tax returns every year. HMRC have that data. They can pull that off. They can see, has this person got taxable income of less than 50,000? Yes, they have. Let's just take the average of the last 3 years and pay, out a grant based on that amount of money. It's nowhere near as easy to do that where you have a company with a director or two and picking up the sort of profits there. So I think, there's a question, how would you actually do it in a manner that it could be automated? And then you've got the separate political question of, is this the right sort of approach? Does this group need to be helped as much more generally? And I can't really comment on that sort of aspect. I just think that administratively, that is a really difficult thing to do.
Do you think it might? I'm just wondering if there is any suggestion that there might be a change to how company directors who are also kind of losing out because of the way they take dividends as well as a small salary. Do you think that is there any do you think there might be any look at that, at revising that?
Well, I think they might look at it because obviously there are, a fair number of people in that category. But as I say, it's not easy to imagine how you could find any form of automated process to provide some sort of help to people. The government is quite clear that it's targeting its help on either somebody who isn't working at all, a furloughed employee, or on a self-employed person whose income is no more than £50,000 a year. They're not in the business, it seems, based on what they've said, of helping somebody whose income is at a higher level. And finding what that income is, where you've got a company with a salary, with some dividends, varies year by year, maybe split between family members, maybe some cash left in the company. It's quite hard to imagine what the process would be for checking that you were targeting the help you really wanted more generally. So yes, obviously a director will declare a dividend income and their salary probably in a self-assessment tax return, but that doesn't necessarily tell you the whole picture about the company and the income in that company generally.
Anyway, I'll leave the time with you at the moment. If you want to run through the questions, let me know when you think they're coming to an end, and I'll come up with some other questions myself.
Well, that's mostly it, really. A lot of people are asking about sort of the intricacies of furloughing certain staff, which I'm thinking would probably be better dealt with tomorrow with Ian Holloway, who's an HR and payroll expert. Somebody has asked, Helen says that she's got a client who just decided that they could manage all their books themselves, and as a result just hadn't declared anything properly for 10 years. So she wonders whether could we ever get to a world where there is a requirement for limited companies to have a bookkeeper or a tax professional working for them? He says radical exclamation mark.
I love the radical idea, and certainly what the Office Tax Simplification has done has just, made the point that quite a lot of people end up with a company without knowing what they're doing. They don't understand what a company is. They don't understand the difference between the individual and the company and all that sort of thing. But on the other hand, the government isn't keen to put barriers in the way of people wishing to set out a business. It's hard to find a sort of easy solution for that. So that's one of the reasons why small businesses don't need a statutory audit. Clearly, if they did, then almost certainly they'd end up wanting a bookkeeper or an accountant to help them, because how else would they get their books audited more generally? So I clearly see the point. I'm not sure that there will be action on that particular one, sadly, but I do think that will leave a gap in the system, which isn't a terribly helpful gap.
Yes, I think that we've done surveys in the past with our members. In fact, we did one about, I'd say it's 5, it's probably closer to 10, but we did a survey of what type of businesses they had and how straightforward businesses were and how upfront businesses were with them, with how their clients were. And I think if you're going to use an external person to look after your books, you're probably one of the better ones who at least thinks, I want to do this properly. Having said that, all those years ago, we averaged out among those people who had responded that there was about £450